home. I look forward to debating this bill further in the House, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Stuart Nash.
I find it astounding that Mr Foss actually believes the vast majority, or a lot of New Zealanders, are looking fondly across the Tasman wanting to come home. Well, maybe if you're earning over $100,000, but if you're earning below the minimum wage, or you're earning $40,000, why would you? They gave no tax cuts to anyone except the wealthy. But anyway, Mr Speaker, I stand in support of this, the Taxation, Annual Rates, Trans-Tasman Savings, Portability, KiwiSaver and Remedial Matters Bill, as it's a common sense piece of legislation, Mr Speaker, that simplifies the law for many. As mentioned by the Minister of Revenue, the bill also includes a number of technical changes to rules surrounding KiwiSaver, gift duty exemptions and binding rulings to improve the way the rules work and to reduce compliance costs for taxpayers and other remedial matters. But I suspect that the main talking point will be that it introduces changes to the tax rules, as alluded to by the other speakers, that allow New Zealanders returning home from Australia to bring their retirement savings with them. Now, this is good for a number of reasons, because it's a way of future-proofing New Zealand. We all know that the current Minister of Revenue was a Labour Party Member of Parliament for a number of years, 10 I think it was, Mr Speaker, and then worked with the Labour Party for a number of years. But he has fluctuated philosophically and politically and has now gone back to the past. But after such a background, and as a Labour man myself, Mr Speaker, I personally cannot see how the honourable member could possibly align himself with a National Party that has overt philosophies around privatisation and tax cuts for the wealthy. What was that figure? 1/3 of tax cuts went to the top 3% of income earners. How could a Labour MP, a former Labour MP for 10 years, sit over there and agree with such philosophies? But it does, especially when they're brought in under urgency. It's amazing, isn't it? It's absolutely astounding. But I suspect that deep down he still retains those social democratic values that define our philosophies, and that the next Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Honourable Phil Goff, personifies so clearly. Now, the reason, Mr Speaker, I say that this is future-proofing the country is that the Minister must know that there will be precious few Kiwis returning to this wonderful country as long as the national government is in power. After all, Mr Speaker, what is attractive about privatising ACC? In fact, I'll tell you what, I'll tell you who will be coming across the ditch in a great hurry. That's the Australian insurance companies, who are wringing their hands in glee and anticipation at the privatisation of ACC. It's coming. And what's next? I ask the members on the other side of the House, because it's what the voters in Napier and New Zealand are asking. Are you going to force children who play sport to pay their own ACC levels? Or the elderly? I mean, let's face facts, the elderly, they use up a bit of the ACC budget. Are you going to start charging them as well? Or what about primary school kids? Another tax on their parents, because of course kids fall out of trees. They use ACC. So what's next? What sort of country is the National Party turning this wonderful New Zealand into? Or shall we go further? I wonder if they're going to privatise KiwiBank. After all, Mr Speaker, Mr English refused to recapitalise, so this bank had to start borrowing offshore. It's disgraceful. What about privatising TVNZ, or even the Department of Conservation? Well, Mr Speaker, it already has to a certain extent, because the government is allowing preferential planting right on Crown land for selected groups. Or I wonder, Mr Speaker, if the National Party is going to accept the advice of their former leader and privatise schools. There's a plan, says Mr English and Mr Key. Let's make money out of education. Well, let me tell you something. Kiwis are not simply pieces of data on a spreadsheet to be manipulated and manoeuvred in a sick attempt to save $1 here and $1 there at the expense of our long-term future and well-being. We are hard-working mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers who are struggling at this point in time, and this just makes it worse. We've seen too much of this with the axing of KiwiSaver contributions, as my colleague, the Honourable David Cunliffe, mentioned. The adult and community education courses. Mr Speaker, did you know that in Napier there are going to now be no night courses run next year? 6,000 people took night courses in Napier this year, none next year, because there's no money to fund them. These courses survived for decades, even under the Right Honourable Sir Robert Muldoon, who really stuffed this country up, but at least he understood the value of education. For a lot of people, second chance education. And then the axing of the tertiary incentive allowance, of which the Honourable Minister who cut this actually, that's how she got her degree. She stood up and she said, if it wasn't for the tertiary incentive allowance, I would not have got my degree, and then she cut it. And now we have a former leader of the National Party, appointed to head a government working party called the Productivity Commission. The Prime Minister stated that this report has some nuggets in it. Well, I wonder what those nuggets are, Mr. Speaker. Maybe doing away with interest-free student loans. Maybe cutting the minimum wage by $100 a week. Imagine that. Imagine cutting the minimum wage by $100 a week. Wow, that's amazing. Or maybe a flat tax structure. Now, that's great if you earn over $100,000 a year and don't give a damn for ordinary Kiwis. But, for example, on the other side of the chamber, for the majority of Kiwis, for the vast majority of Kiwis, this sort of productivity report is a slap in the face for ordinary, good, hard-working New Zealanders, and that government should be ashamed. What are we going to see next year, Mr. Speaker? The whole of New Zealand will hold their breath in anticipation. Watch the rush to the travel agents as Kiwis book their tickets to Australia for a couple of years before coming back to New Zealand once Phil Goff becomes Prime Minister in 2011. He is a man of integrity, honesty and substance and will make a great Prime Minister, so go eat that, Amy Adams. But as mentioned, this bill is future-proofing the country for when Kiwis choose to return, because this is a sensible arrangement that allows New Zealanders to bring their Australian superannuation funds back to New Zealand and consolidate them under one account. This is sensible and common sense for a number of reasons, Mr. Speaker, but one of the most compelling is that there is potentially $16.6 billion in lost contributions from New Zealanders working in Australia that under this scheme could come back to New Zealand. Even if a fraction of that money was to come back home, it would have a positive impact. And if you look at the problems that are going on in Australia at the moment, they're into their fire season. I think they have 52,000 fires a year. They've got a water shortage problem. Water is our competitive advantage. New Zealand is no oasis. There will be New Zealanders coming back in 2011. Don't you worry about that. But like I said, if even a fraction of this was to return once Labor regains government treasury benches, then this would be good for the country. And it's only 2 more years. But those are 2 years too long for many hard-working New Zealanders who are struggling to make ends meet under this government. And imagine the outflow from this country of Don Brash's suggestion that the minimum wage should drop by $100 a week was one of the nuggets that Mr. Key and Mr. English liked. That, Mr. Speaker, is not a way to achieve parity with Australia, unless parity means emptying out the country of people who could simply not afford to stay here. And as we know, Mr. Speaker, as you know well, the Australians actually have a compulsory superannuation fund, which makes this bill a very attractive proposition for us in New Zealand. In fact, Mr. Speaker, believe it or not, New Zealand actually used to have a compulsory superannuation fund. So when Mr. Foss stands on the other side of the chamber and looks across here and said, the Australians seem to have that side of things better sorted than us in New Zealand, he is dead right. They do. They have compulsory superannuation. We used to have compulsory superannuation over here, didn't we, Sir Roger? We had compulsory superannuation over here until it's... Who designed it, Sir Roger? Until a chap called Sir Robert Muldoon apparently illegally abolished it. Imagine how better off this country would be if he hadn't. Goodness me, it's unbelievable. We are on the way a second time. The first step implemented by Dr. Cullen and Phil Goff and Labor with KiwiSaver. Very popular, but true to form, the National Party cut the employer contribution from 4% to 2%. Amazing. How is that going to increase productivity? Well, it's not going to. So I will support this bill through to committee stage. We will go over it with the level of scrutiny it deserves and New Zealanders expect. And we will end up with the type of robust legislation that they came to expect over the 9 years of a Labor government, but they have been let down recently due to a lack of process and too much urgency for important legislation under this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.